The Gila River ran wild that morning, swollen with 3 days of mountain rain that had turned its usually placid surface into a churning beast of mud and debris. Jacob Thornwood heard it before he saw it, a low roar that made his horse, Dust, pin her ears back and dance sideways on the canyon trail. "Easy, girl," Jacob murmured, his weathered hand steady on the reins. At 42, he'd seen plenty of flash floods in the Arizona territory, but something about this one felt different, wrong. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. That's when he heard the scream. It cut through the river's thunder like a knife, high, desperate, and unmistakably human. Jacob's gray eyes snapped toward the sound, and his breath caught in his throat. There, maybe 200 yards downstream, where the river bent sharp around a column of ancient red rock, a woman clung to a cottonwood branch that jutted from the water like a skeletal hand. The current battered her mercilessly, her dark hair plastered to her face, one arm wrapped around the wood while the other flailed for purchase against the relentless flow. Jacob didn't think, couldn't think. His body moved on instinct honed by decades on the frontier. He kicked Dust into a gallop along the ridge, racing parallel to the river, his mind already calculating angles and timing. The cottonwood was dying. He could see it even from this distance, and when it gave way, she'd be swept into the devil's throat, a narrow chute of rapids that had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the water's rage. The ridge dropped sharply ahead where an old game trail switched back down to the riverbank. Jacob pulled Dust to a skidding halt, already swinging down from the saddle. He grabbed his lariat from the saddle horn, testing the rope's strength with a sharp tug. Good. Strong. It would have to be enough. The woman's head turned toward him, and even at this distance, Jacob felt the impact of her gaze. Dark eyes wide with terror, but still fighting, still alive. Something twisted in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in the 7 years since Mary's death. "I'm coming," he called, scrambling down the rocky trail. Loose stones skittered beneath his boots, and he used the momentum to propel himself faster, half running, half falling toward the water's edge. Behind him, an old voice drifted on the wind, or maybe it was just memory. His grandmother's words from decades past. "The river knows, Jacob. The river always knows who needs saving and who does the saving." He shook off the thought. Now wasn't the time for childhood stories. The riverbank was a treacherous mix of mud and rounded river stones that had been underwater just days ago. Jacob found his footing on a flat boulder that jutted into the current, feeling the spray soak through his shirt. The woman was closer now, maybe 50 feet away, and he could see her lips moving, praying, cursing, or simply willing herself to survive. The cottonwood groaned, a sound like splitting bone. "Listen to me," Jacob shouted, forming a loop in his lariat. "When I throw this rope, you grab it with both hands. You hear me? Both hands." She stared at him, and for a heartbeat, he thought she hadn't understood. Then she nodded, a small, fierce movement that told him everything he needed to know about her will to live. Jacob began to swing the lariat, building momentum, judging the distance and the current's pull. He'd roped hundreds of cattle in his life, pulled calves from mud bogs and wolves from trap lines, but this was different. This was a human life suspended above an abyss of churning water. One chance, he thought. One throw. The rope left his hand in a perfect arc, spinning through the spray-filled air. It seemed to hang there forever, suspended in a moment where everything, the river, the rocks, the very breath in his lungs, went still. The loop settled over the woman's shoulder and head. "Now!" Jacob roared. "Let go of the tree and grab the rope." For a terrible second, she hesitated. He could see the fear in her eyes, the primal reluctance to release the only thing keeping her alive. Then the cottonwood gave an ominous crack, and the decision was made for her. She grabbed the rope with both hands. The cottonwood surrendered to the river. The current seized her with vicious force, and suddenly Jacob was holding not just a woman, but the full weight of the Gillis fury. The rope burned through his gloves, and he leaned back, his boots fighting for purchase on the wet stone. The river wanted her. He could feel it in the way the water pulled, not just with physical force, but with something deeper, something that felt almost intentional. "No," he grunted through gritted teeth. "You don't get her." Hand over hand, he pulled. His shoulders screamed in protest, muscles straining against the current's implacable strength. The woman helped as best she could, using the rope to pull herself toward him rather than simply hanging dead weight. And that cooperation made all the difference. Inch by inch, she came closer. The water fought him for every foot, trying to drag her downstream toward the rapids that would surely kill her. Jacob's vision narrowed to just this: the rope in his hands, the woman in the water, the space between them that needed to disappear. "That's it," he called out. "Keep coming, almost there." When she was within reach, Jacob made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational person. He dropped the rope, lunged forward, and grabbed her outstretched hand. Their fingers locked. The moment their skin touched, something happened that Jacob would never be able to fully explain. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and for a fraction of a second, he wasn't standing on a riverbank in 1891. He was somewhere else, someone else. He saw flames dancing in a ceremonial circle, heard drums beating in rhythm, with a heart that might have been his own, or might have been hers, or might have belonged to the earth itself. And he heard words in a language he didn't know but somehow understood. Two souls, one river, bound by blood and water until the prophecy is fulfilled. Then reality snapped back like a released bowstring, and he was pulling her up onto the boulder, both of them collapsing in a tangle of soaked clothing and gasping breaths. The woman coughed violently, water streaming from her mouth and nose. Jacob rolled her onto her side, supporting her with one hand while she expelled the river from her lungs. When the coughing subsided, she lay still for a moment, her dark hair spreading around her head like raven's wings. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse and raw. "You saved my life." Jacob sat back on his heels, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. "You're alive. That's what matters." She pushed herself up to a sitting position, and now, in the harsh light of day, he could see her clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with high cheekbones and bronze skin that spoke of native heritage. Her eyes were the color of obsidian, sharp with intelligence despite her ordeal. She wore what had once been a fine traveling dress, now torn and muddy beyond recognition. "I'm Jacob Thornwood," he said, because in a situation this strange, normal introductions seemed like an anchor to reality. "Ayasha," she studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Ayasha Whitehorse." The name stirred something in his memory, stories his grandmother had told, legends of the Whitehorse clan that went back generations. But before he could pursue the thought, Ayasha spoke again. "You felt it too, didn't you? When we touched." Jacob stiffened. "Felt what?" "Don't." Her voice was sharp now, commanding despite her bedraggled state. "Don't pretend you didn't see it. The vision, the fire and the drums and the words you couldn't understand but did anyway." He wanted to deny it, wanted to chalk it up to adrenaline and fear and the strange tricks the mind plays under stress. But the memory was too vivid, too real to dismiss. "What was that?" he asked quietly. Ayasha pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. When she looked at him again, there was something ancient in her gaze, something that made her seem far older than her years. "That," she said, "was the beginning of a prophecy my grandmother told me about when I was 6 years old. A prophecy I didn't believe until 30 seconds ago." The river roared behind them, indifferent to human concerns, ancient prophecies, or the two strangers who had just become entangled in something neither of them understood. Jacob built a fire in the shelter of an overhanging cliff about a mile upriver. From where they'd come ashore, dust had followed him down from the ridge, loyal as ever, and now stood hobbled nearby, cropping at sparse desert grass. The sun had climbed to its zenith, turning the canyon into a furnace. But here in the shade with the fire's warmth, Ayasha had finally stopped shivering. She'd been silent for most of the walk, and Jacob hadn't pushed her. He'd seen enough in his years to know that sometimes people needed space to process their survival. Death had come close enough to touch her, and that kind of proximity left marks that went deeper than any physical wound. But now, as he handed her a tin cup of coffee brewed strong enough to strip paint, He couldn't hold back the questions anymore. "Start from the beginning," he said, settling onto a flat rock across the fire from her. "How'd you end up in the river?" Ayasha wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing warmth from the metal. "I was traveling from the San Carlos reservation to Tucson. The stagecoach driver was drunk, I could smell it on him. But I had no choice. We needed to cross the river at Canyon Ford. The ford's been washed out for days," Jacob said, frowning. "Any fool could see that." "Exactly." Her voice was bitter. But he was too drunk to care and too stubborn to turn back. The coach made it halfway across before the current caught the wheels. It went over like a toy, and she paused, closing her eyes. "I went into the water. The driver and the other passengers, I don't know what happened to them." Jacob's jaw tightened. Tomorrow, at first light, he'd ride down to Canyon Ford and look for survivors. But in his gut, he already knew what he'd find. The Gila didn't give back what it took. "You said something before," he pressed gently, "about a prophecy." Ayasha was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, taken on a cadence that reminded him of storytellers and shamans. "My grandmother was a medicine woman of the Apache people," she began. "She had the sight, the ability to see what was, what is, and what might be. When I was a child, she told me a story about two people who would meet at the water's edge. One would be drowning in more than river water, and the other would be drowning in silence and loneliness. They would touch, and in that touch, they would see the fire of an old promise, a debt that spans lifetimes." "That's just a story," Jacob said, but his words lacked conviction even to his own ears. "Is it?" Ayasha's obsidian eyes fixed on him. "Then explain what you saw when our hands touched. Explain why you're out here alone on a day when any sensible person would stay away from the river. Explain why, out of all the miles of canyon, you were in exactly the right place at exactly the right time." Jacob had no answers for that. He'd ridden out this morning on a whim, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name. He'd taken a trail he rarely used, compelled by nothing more than a feeling that he needed to be moving, needed to be somewhere else. And now here she was, this stranger with her ancient eyes and her impossible story. "What kind of debt?" he asked. Ayasha set down her coffee cup and began to draw in the dirt with a stick. The shape that emerged was circular, with intricate patterns spiraling inward, a symbol that made something in Jacob's chest tighten with recognition he couldn't explain. 150 years ago, she said, during the first conflicts between my people and the white settlers pushing west, a warrior named White Buffalo saved the life of a fur trapper named Thomas Thornwood. The trapper was caught in a spring flood, much like the one today. White Buffalo pulled him from the water at great risk to himself. Jacob's breath caught. "Thornwood, that's your ancestor," Ayasha confirmed. "Thomas Thornwood made a promise that day. He swore on his life and the lives of all who came after him that if ever a descendant of White Buffalo needed help, true help, life or death help, the Thornwood blood would answer. It was witnessed by the river itself and sealed with fire. A sacred oath. That's..." Jacob struggled for words. "That's impossible. Oaths don't work like that, don't they?" She looked up from her drawing. "You're here, aren't you? And I'm alive because of it. The prophecy said that when the debt was called due, the river would be the messenger. The river would bring us together." Jacob stood abruptly, pacing the small space of their shelter. Every rational part of his mind rejected what she was saying. People didn't inherit debts across generations. Visions weren't real. Prophecies were just stories told around fires to pass the time. But that feeling when their hands had touched, that had been real. And the strange compulsion that had brought him to this stretch of river at precisely the right moment, that had been real too. "Let's say I believe you," he said slowly. "Let's say there's something to this prophecy. What happens now? The debt's paid, isn't it? I pulled you out of the river. You're safe." The look Ayasha gave him was complicated, part sympathy, part dread, part steely determination. "That was just the first test," she said. "The river brought us together, but the prophecy isn't complete, not yet." "What do you mean?" She stood, moving to the edge of the overhang where she could see the river still churning below. "My grandmother told me that the debt would be paid in 3 parts. Water, earth, and fire. You saved me from the water. But there are 2 more trials coming, and they'll be worse than the first. Trials? Jacob's voice came out sharper than he intended. This isn't some kind of spiritual quest. Miss Whitehorse, this is life, real life. I saved you because that's what any decent person would do, not because of some mystical debt from a century and a half ago. Then why did you see the vision? She challenged, turning to face him. Why did you feel the connection? You can deny the prophecy all you want, Jacob Thornwood, but something brought us together, and something is going to test us. Whether you believe or not won't change that. They stared at each other across the small space, and Jacob felt the weight of something enormous settling onto his shoulders, a burden he hadn't asked for and didn't want. 7 years ago, his wife had died giving birth to a stillborn son, and he'd spent every day since trying to outrun the grief that threatened to swallow him whole. The last thing he needed was to be entangled in mystical prophecies and ancient debts. But looking at Ayasha, at the certainty in her eyes and the way she held herself despite having just faced death, he couldn't simply walk away. Maybe it was the oath if such a thing truly existed, or maybe it was something simpler. The recognition that this woman needed his help, and he was the only one who could give it. Where were you headed? He asked finally, before the coach went into the river. Tucson, she said. I'm a teacher. I was supposed to start at a school for Apache children next week. That's 3 days' ride from here. Maybe 4 if we take it slow. He made his decision. I'll get you there safely. After that, whatever this prophecy says, whatever trials are supposed to come, you'll be among your own people. They can help you through it. You can't just deliver me like a package and walk away, Ayasha protested. The prophecy binds us together. If you leave before it's complete, then I guess we'll find out if these old stories have any teeth. Jacob interrupted. But I'm not about to spend the rest of my life waiting for some mystical trial to appear. I'll get you to Tucson. That's the best I can offer. Ayasha studied him for a long moment, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing right through him, past his words, past his defenses, down to the scared and lonely man he'd become since Mary's death. All right, she said finally. Tucson it is. But when the second trial comes, Jacob Thornwood, and it will come, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that you were warned. They set out at dawn the next day, sharing Dust's back because there was no other option. Ayasha sat in front, and Jacob tried not to think about how close they had to ride or how aware he was of her presence. It had been a long time since he'd been this near to anyone, and the intimacy of it made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. The trail to Tucson wound through high desert country, a landscape of red rock mesas, saguaro forests, and dry washes that could turn deadly in minutes if the rains came again. Jacob knew this land, like he knew his own face in a mirror, but today it felt different, foreign, as if the earth itself was watching them with ancient, patient eyes. They didn't talk much that first day. Ayasha seemed lost in her own thoughts, and Jacob was content to let the silence stretch. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, she finally broke the quiet. Tell me about your wife. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. What makes you think I had a wife? You have the look, she said simply. The look of a man who loved someone deeply and lost them. My father had the same look after my mother passed. He could have deflected, could have changed the subject, or simply refused to answer. But something about the way she'd said it, without pity, without probing, just a simple statement of fact, made him want to talk. For the first time in years, he actually wanted to share the weight he'd been carrying alone. Her name was Mary, he said. We met in Kansas when I was working a cattle drive. She was the preacher's daughter, and I was the least likely man for her to fall in love with. But somehow, he trailed off, remembering the way Mary had laughed, bright and clear as bells. We had 6 good years together. Then she got pregnant, and we were so happy. We were going to name him Samuel. What happened? The birth went wrong. The words came out flat, emotionless, because that was the only way he could say them. The doctor said it was just one of those things, bad luck, bad timing. She bled too much, and the baby never took his first breath. I buried them both on a Tuesday afternoon under a cottonwood tree. Ayasha was silent for a moment. That's why you live out here alone. Why you ride the empty trails. I couldn't stay in town, Jacob admitted. Everywhere I looked, I saw her, heard her. I kept turning corners expecting to find her there. And the disappointment when she wasn't. It was like losing her over and over again. So you came to the desert to lose yourself. I came to the desert to forget. But you haven't, Ayasha said gently. Forgetting isn't the same as healing. Jacob didn't answer. What could he say? She was right. Of course, 7 years. And the wound was still as fresh as the day it had been made. He'd just gotten better at not touching it. I'm sorry you lost them, Ayasha continued. But maybe that's why the prophecy brought us together. Maybe you were meant to save me because you couldn't save them. Don't, Jacob said sharply. Don't try to make this into some kind of cosmic redemption story. I pulled you out of a river. That's all. Is it? She twisted in the saddle to look at him. Because it seems to me like you've been drowning just as surely as I was. Only your water is grief instead of the Gila. Maybe saving me was also about saving yourself. Her words hit too close to home. And Jacob felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built brick by brick over the years, now showing its first fissure. He wanted to be angry at her presumption, at the way she'd casually dissected his life and motivations. But beneath the anger was something else, a desperate, painful hope that maybe she was right. Maybe this strange confluence of events could mean something more than simple chance. They made camp that night in a box canyon that offered protection from the wind and any predators that might be prowling. Jacob built another fire while Ayasha tended to dust, and he noticed how naturally she moved around the horse, how competent she was despite her ordeal. She wasn't some fragile damsel who needed constant protection. She was a survivor, hardened by her own losses and trials. After they'd eaten a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Ayasha began to sing. It was a low, haunting melody in her native tongue, and though Jacob couldn't understand the words, he felt their meaning in his bones. It was a song of mourning and remembrance, of honoring those who'd gone ahead into the darkness. When she finished, the silence that followed felt sacred. My grandmother taught me that song, Ayasha said, staring into the fire. She said it was for times when the grief is too heavy to carry alone. You sing it. And the ancestors here, they help carry the weight, do they? Jacob asked. Do you really believe that? I have to, she replied simply. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? If we're just born and die and nothing we do matters, if the people we love just disappear into nothing, I can't accept that. I won't. Jacob thought about that as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. In their ancient patterns, maybe that was the difference between them. Ayasha still had her faith in prophecies, in ancestors, in meaning and purpose. He'd lost his faith the day he'd watched them lower Mary and Samuel into the ground. But sitting here with this strange woman who'd come into his life on a current of wild water, he felt something stirring that might have been the first seeds of belief, beginning to take root again. They were 2 days from Tucson when the earth decided to collect its due. They'd been riding through a narrow defile between 2 high mesas, the walls of red sandstone rising hundreds of feet on either side. It was midday, the heat pressing down like a physical weight, and Jacob was focused on navigating the rocky trail when Ayasha suddenly went rigid in front of him. Stop, she whispered. What is it? Something's wrong. The earth is angry. Before Jacob could respond, he felt it too, a deep, subsonic rumble that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Dust whinnied nervously, dancing sideways, and then the world began to shake. Earthquake. Jacob had experienced tremors before, minor shivers that rattled dishes and set dogs barking. But this was different. This was the earth itself trying to tear free of its moorings. The walls of the defile began to crack, huge slabs of rock breaking free and plummeting down with thunderous crashes. Move, Jacob, shouted, kicking dust into a gallop. They raced down the narrowing passage as the world disintegrated around them. Boulders the size of wagons exploded against the trail behind them, sending up clouds of choking dust. Ayasha clung to the saddle horn, and Jacob wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her steady as dust ran for both their lives. The defile seemed to stretch on forever, each second an eternity of falling rock and splitting stone. Jacob's vision narrowed to just the path ahead, to the sliver of daylight that marked the exit. They were going to make it. They had to make it. Then, with a crack like the breaking of the world, the canyon wall above them gave way. Jacob saw it coming, a massive section of the mesa face shearing off in a deadly avalanche. There was no time to think, no time to plan. He threw himself and Ayasha from the saddle, and they hit the ground hard, rolling toward the base of the opposite wall. Dust! Ayasha screamed. The horse tried to follow, but she wasn't fast enough. The rock slide caught her in a crushing wave of stone and dust. Her final scream was mercifully brief. Then the rumbling stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. Jacob pushed himself to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and looked back at where they'd been seconds before. The trail was gone, buried under tons of rock, and somewhere beneath that cairn of stone was dust. No, he breathed. No, no, no. He started toward the pile, knowing it was futile, but unable to stop himself. Dust had been with him for 9 years. She'd carried him through grief and isolation, had been his one constant companion in a world that had taken everything else. And now she was gone, crushed because he'd chosen to save Ayasha first. Ayasha's hand on his arm stopped him. Jacob, she's gone. I'm sorry, but she's gone. We could dig. There's nothing to dig, you know that. Her voice was gentle but firm. And if we don't get moving, we'll be trapped here. Look. She pointed to where the rock slide had completely blocked the defile behind them. The only way was forward, on foot, in the brutal heat of midday. Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. But Ayasha was right. Dust was dead, and if they didn't move, they'd follow her into the ground. The second trial. He said bitterly, "This is what you meant, isn't it, Earth?" Yes. Ayasha's face was pale beneath its bronze hue, and he could see that she was shaken despite her outward calm. The prophecy said Earth would test us next, test our resolve, our ability to keep going when everything is taken away. Well, mission accomplished. Jacob spat. He immediately regretted the harshness in his voice. None of this was Ayasha's fault, but the anger had to go somewhere, and she was the only target available. What's next? Does fire take my arm? Does water come back for another round? I don't know, she admitted. My grandmother never told me the specifics, just that there would be 3 trials and that we had to face them together. If we fail, if we break, what happens if we break? She looked at him with those ancient eyes. Then the debt goes unpaid, and the consequences fall on both our bloodlines for generations to come. The prophecy incomplete, the balance unrestored. Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. So not only am I responsible for keeping you alive, but if I fail, I'm cursing my descendants, assuming I ever have any, which doesn't seem likely for the rest of time. That's fantastic, really fantastic. I didn't ask for this, Ayasha said quietly. I didn't ask to be thrown in a river or to have your ancestor save mine, 150 years ago. But here we are, Jacob, here we are. And all we can do is keep moving forward. She was right. Damn her, she was absolutely right. Jacob took a deep breath, forcing down the anger and the grief and the exhaustion. He checked their supplies. His saddlebags had somehow remained strapped to his back during the tumble, so they had some water and food, not much, but enough to make it to Tucson if they rationed. Carefully. All right, he said. We walk. It's about 30 miles to the next water source, and then another 20 to Tucson. We travel in the early morning and late evening, rest during the heat of the day. We should make it in 3 days, maybe 4. And you? Ayasha asked, will you make it? He knew what she was really asking. Would he break? Would he give up? Let the grief and anger overwhelm him. Leave her stranded in the desert to settle her own accounts with prophecy and fate? Jacob thought about it, really thought about it, because the truth was, part of him wanted to do exactly that. Wanted to walk away from this impossible woman and her impossible story, and return to the simple loneliness of his life before the river. But then he remembered the moment their hands had touched on the riverbank. The vision of fire and drums and words that meant commitment. Promise, sacred trust. I'll make it. He said, we both will. They started walking. The desert is unforgiving. but it's also honest in its cruelty. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, a place where the weak die, and the strong sometimes survive. As Jacob and Ayasha made their way across the broken landscape, the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil, that honesty became a strange kind of comfort. They walked in silence for the first few hours, conserving their strength and their water. But as the sun began its descent and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive, Ayasha began to talk again. "Tell me about Dust," she said. Jacob glanced at her, surprised. "What do you want to know?" "Anything, everything. She deserves to be remembered." So he told her. He told her about buying Dust as a 3-year-old filly, barely broke and full of fire. He told her about the first time he'd saddled her, and how she'd bucked him off so hard he'd seen stars. He told her about the morning after Mary died, when he'd walked out to the barn intent on ending his own life, and how Dust had pressed her velvet nose into his chest and just stood there, breathing with him, until the moment passed. "She saved my life," he said simply, "and I let her die." "You didn't let her die," Ayasha corrected. "The earth took her, just like it took my mother and your wife and countless others throughout time. We don't control these things, Jacob. We only control how we respond to them." "And how should I respond?" he asked bitterly. "With acceptance, with serenity." "I'm not built that way." "No one is," Ayasha said. "But we can choose to honor our dead by continuing to live, by finishing what they helped us start." They camped that night in the lee of a mesa, rationing their water carefully and chewing on strips of dried meat that tasted like leather. The stars came out in their millions, so bright and numerous that the skies seemed to pulse with cold fire. "Do you see that constellation?" Ayasha asked, pointing. "The one that looks like a man carrying a burden?" Jacob followed her finger. "Can't say I do. My people call it the Bearer. The story goes that he was a warrior who promised to carry his brother's body home from a battle, no matter how far the journey or how heavy the burden. He carried that body for 100 days and 100 nights, across rivers and mountains and deserts. And when he finally reached his village, he'd been transformed. The burden had made him something more than he was. What happened to him? He became a teacher, used his strength not for war, but to help others carry their own burdens. The story is meant to remind us that sometimes the hardest journeys make us who we're meant to be." Jacob stared at the stars, thinking about burdens and journeys and transformations. "You're a good teacher," he said finally. "Those kids in Tucson are lucky to have you." "If I get there," Ayasha said quietly. "If we get there, we will." And for the first time since Dust had died, Jacob actually believed it. The next day was harder. Their water was running low, and the heat was intense. They started before dawn and walked until the sun made it impossible to continue, then sheltered beneath an overhang and tried to rest. But rest was elusive. Jacob's mind kept replaying Dust's final scream, kept calculating all the ways he could have done things differently. "Stop it," Ayasha said, without opening her eyes. "Stop what?" "Stop torturing yourself. I can hear you thinking from here." "You can't hear thinking. I can hear yours. It's loud." "Despite everything," Jacob smiled, "you're bossy for someone I rescued from a river, and you're stubborn for someone carrying out an ancient prophecy." They looked at each other, and suddenly they were both laughing, really laughing, the kind of deep, belly-shaking laughter that comes from exhaustion and stress and the sheer absurdity of being alive, when by all rights they should be dead. When the laughter finally subsided, something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down. "I'm glad you're here," Jacob said. "Even if it's because of some mystical debt and trials and all that, I'm glad." Ayasha reached out and took his hand. "So am I." They found water that evening, a small spring hidden in a grove of mesquite trees. They drank deeply, refilled their canteen, and felt strength returning to their limbs. They were going to make it. Tucson was less than a day's walk away. That night, as they lay on opposite sides of a small fire, Ayasha spoke into the darkness. "Jacob? Yeah, thank you for not leaving me, for keeping your promise even when it cost you everything." He was quiet for a long moment. "The thing is, Ayasha, I don't think it cost me everything. I think maybe it gave me something back, something I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" a reason to keep going. They saw the smoke before they saw the town. It rose from Tucson in thick, black columns that stained the morning sky. Jacob's gut clenched with a premonition he couldn't name, and beside him, Ayasha went pale. "No," she whispered, "not fire. Please, not fire." But fire it was. They ran the last 2 miles, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of catastrophe. As they crested the final rise, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Tucson was burning. Not just a single building, or even a block. Half the town was engulfed in flames that leaped from structure to structure with terrifying speed. People filled the streets, some fighting the fire with bucket brigades, others fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry. The air was thick with smoke and screaming. "The school," Ayasha gasped. "The school where I was supposed to teach, it's in the northern district. That's where the fire is worst." Jacob grabbed her arm as she started forward. "You can't. There might be children inside," she said, her eyes fierce. "It's Saturday, but some of the students live there. Orphans. If they're trapped." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jacob could see it in her face. This was the third trial, the final test. Fire, consuming everything in its path, and them standing at the edge of the inferno with a choice to make. They could turn back, could say they'd tried, that they'd fulfilled the prophecy as best they could. Tucson was full of people, after all. Others would save the children if they could be saved, or they could run toward the flames. Jacob thought about Thomas Thornwood, his ancestor, who'd been saved from a flood by white buffalo. He thought about the promise made and the debt incurred. He thought about Dust and Mary and Samuel and all the losses that had brought him to this moment. Then he looked at Ayasha, saw the determination in her face, and made his choice. "Let's go," he said. They plunged into the chaos. The streets were a nightmare of heat and confusion. Embers rained down like hellish snow, starting new fires wherever they landed. The smoke was so thick that Jacob had to squint to see more than a few feet ahead. Ayasha pulled her torn dress up over her mouth and nose, and he did the same with his bandana. "Which way?" he shouted over the roar of the flames. "North." She grabbed his hand. That connection again. That electric sense of rightness and pulled him forward. They dodged around bucket brigades and panicking horses, pushed through crowds of people fleeing in the opposite direction. Everyone they passed looked at them like they were insane. And maybe they were. Maybe this whole thing, the prophecy, the trials, the impossible connection between them was just madness born of trauma and grief. But Jacob didn't think so, not anymore. The school was a 2-story adobe building on the northern edge of town, and when they finally reached it, his heart sank. The entire structure was engulfed, flames pouring from every window like the building was exhaling fire. The heat was so intense they had to stop 30 feet away, and even at that distance, Jacob could feel his skin blistering. "There's no way anyone's alive in there," he said, having to shout to be heard. "Listen." Ayasha held up her hand. At first, Jacob couldn't hear anything over the fire's roar, but then, faint as a ghost, he caught it, a child's scream, coming from somewhere inside the building. "Second floor," Ayasha said. "Western corner. I can hear them. The stairs must be gone by now. There's no way up." But Ayasha was already moving, circling the building with Jacob close behind. On the western side, away from the worst of the flames, they found what they were looking for. A large water tank mounted on wooden stilts, used to supply the school's well. The tank itself was empty, probably drained to fight the fire, but the stilts were still intact, and they ran right up against the second-story wall. "We can climb up," Ayasha said. "That wood is half burnt," Jacob protested. "It'll never hold us." "It has to." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not just determination but absolute certainty. "This is it, Jacob. This is the final trial. We go in together, or the prophecy fails and all of this, the river, the earthquake, everything we've endured, it all means nothing." Jacob looked at the burning building, at the rickety stilts that might collapse at any moment, at this woman who'd come into his life on a current of wild water and changed everything. He thought about the vision they'd shared, about sacred oaths and ancient debts. He thought about being more than just a man waiting to die. "Together," he said. They climbed. The wood groaned under their weight, and Jacob could feel the heat from the fire radiating through the adobe walls. His hands were slick with sweat, making every grip treacherous. Below them, the stilts began to crack, small pops and snaps that promised imminent collapse. Faster, Ayasha urged. They reached the second-story level just as the stilts gave way behind them, crashing down in a shower of sparks and burning wood. There was no going back now. The only way out was through. Ayasha kicked in the window. It was already cracked from the heat, and they climbed into hell itself. The second floor was a maze of smoke and flame. The fire hadn't consumed everything yet, but it was close. The walls glowed with heat, and the floor beneath their feet was dangerously hot. They could hear the beams overhead groaning, ready to give way at any moment. "Where are they?" Jacob shouted. "This way." They followed the sound of crying to a classroom at the far end of the hall. The door was jammed, warped by heat, and Jacob had to throw his shoulder against it 3 times before it gave way. Inside, they found them. 3 children, the oldest maybe 10, huddled in the corner farthest from the flames. 2 girls and a boy, all Apache, all terrified out of their minds. "We're here to help," Ayasha said in a language Jacob didn't understand, but the children seemed to. "We're going to get you out." The oldest girl pointed to the doorway and shook her head frantically, saying something in rapid Apache. Ayasha's face went pale. "She says the hall is blocked," she translated. "The ceiling collapsed while they were hiding in here. We can't go back the way we came." Jacob looked around desperately. The window. It was their only chance. He ran to it, looked out, and his stomach dropped. They were at least 20 feet up, and there was nothing below but hard-packed earth and burning debris. Even if they could somehow lower the children down, the fall would likely kill them. But then he saw it, a hay wagon, overturned in the street maybe 15 feet to the left. If they could jump to it, it's suicide, Ayasha said, reading his thoughts. "You got a better idea?" She didn't. Jacob pulled off his belt and began tying it to his bandana, his hands working with desperate speed. "Give me anything we can use as rope. Anything." Ayasha tore strips from her already tattered dress. The children, understanding what was happening, added their own clothing to the makeshift rope. It wasn't much, maybe 8 feet total, but it would have to be enough. Jacob tied one end to the heavy desk near the window and threw the other end out, then turned to the children. "You first," he said to the oldest girl. Though he knew she couldn't understand, he pantomimed what he wanted. "Climb down the rope, swing toward the hay wagon, let go and jump." The girl shook her head, terrified, but Ayasha spoke to her in their shared language, her voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos. Finally, the girl nodded. She climbed down the makeshift rope with the agility of youth, and when she was at the end, Jacob leaned out the window, the heat threatening to blister his face, and began swinging the rope, building momentum. On the third swing, he shouted now, and the girl let go. For a terrible moment, she hung in the air, suspended between life and death. Then she landed in the hay wagon, safe. They repeated the process with the second child, then the third. Each time, Jacob's arms burned with the effort of swinging the rope. Each time, he was certain the child would miss, would fall, would die. But each time, they made it. "Your turn," he told Ayasha. "Not without you. There's no time to argue. The building is coming down." As if to emphasize his point, a beam crashed down in the hallway, sending up a shower of sparks. The fire was closing in, consuming the last safe spaces. "Together," Ayasha said, grabbing his hand. "That's what the prophecy said. Together or not at all." Jacob wanted to argue, but he saw the absolute conviction in her eyes. She would rather die here than leave him behind. "Fine," he growled, "but I go first. If the rope breaks, at least you'll know not to try it." Before she could protest, he climbed out the window, gripping the makeshift rope with hands that were raw and blistered. His weight immediately stretched the material, and he heard stitches popping, but it held, barely. He began to swing, building momentum, trying not to think about the ground below or the flames behind. On the third swing, he let go. The world spun. He flew through smoke-filled air, arms windmilling, gravity pulling him down. For a moment, he was certain he'd miscalculated, that he'd fall short of the wagon and hit the hard earth below. Then he crashed into the hay, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but leaving him miraculously unbroken. "Ayasha," he shouted, looking up. "Come on." She was already climbing down, and he could see the rope starting to fray where it was tied to the desk. The fire had reached the classroom, and flames were licking at the window frame. "Swing," he shouted. "Swing now." She swung once, twice, building speed. On the third swing, the rope snapped, but Ayasha had already let go. She sailed through the air, and Jacob had just enough time to position himself before she landed on top of him, driving them both deep into the hay. For a moment, they lay tangled together, gasping and coughing, unable to believe they were alive. Then the school collapsed. The entire structure came down in a roar of flame and dust, the sound like the end of the world. If they'd been inside even 10 seconds longer, they would have been crushed or burned or both. Instead, they were here, alive, surrounded by 3 frightened children who were also, impossibly, alive. Jacob and Ayasha crawled out of the hay wagon, helped the children down, and staggered away from the burning ruins. People were running toward them now, townspeople who'd seen the rescue, who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. And as Jacob stood there, covered in soot and ash, his hands blistered and his lungs burning, he felt something shift inside him. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest for 7 years, the grief that had defined him, seemed lighter suddenly, not gone, but manageable, transformed into something else, something that felt almost like peace. Ayasha stood beside him, and when she took his hand this time, there was no vision, no drums or fire or ancient words, just the warm, solid reality of another person's touch, of connection, of shared survival. "It's done," she said softly. "The trials are complete. The debt is paid. What happens now?" Jacob asked. "Now," she smiled, tired but genuine. "Now we live. We heal. We move forward. Together." She squeezed his hand. "If you'll have me." Jacob looked at this woman who'd come into his life on a river current, who'd walked through earthquake and fire by his side, who'd somehow pulled him back from the edge of his own grief and shown him that life could still hold meaning. "Yeah," he said. "Together." 3 months later, Jacob stood on the bank of the Gila River, watching the water flow past with the easy grace of late spring. The river had calmed since that wild day in early March, returned to its natural rhythm, but he would never look at it the same way again. Behind him, he heard footsteps, and then Ayasha was there, slipping her hand into his. "The school is ready," she said. "We start classes next week." They'd spent a month since the fire rebuilding not just the school, but their lives. Ayasha had asked him to stay in Tucson, to help her establish the new school for Apache children. At first, Jacob had hesitated. He wasn't a teacher, wasn't good with kids, wasn't sure he had anything to offer. But Ayasha had seen something in him that he'd been blind to. She'd seen a man who could protect, who could inspire, who could show children what it meant to keep going when everything seemed lost. And slowly, carefully, he'd begun to believe her. The children from the fire had been the first to enroll. They followed Jacob around like puppies. These 3 small survivors who saw in him something heroic. It made him uncomfortable at first. He'd just done what needed doing, but Ayasha had explained it in a way he could understand. "You showed them that someone will always come," she'd said, "that even in the worst moments, there are people who run toward the fire instead of away from it. That's worth more than any lesson I could teach in a classroom." Now, as they stood by the river, Jacob felt the last pieces of his old life falling away. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer defined him. Mary and Samuel would always be part of his story, but they weren't the end of it. Just a chapter, a painful chapter, but not the final word. "Do you still think about it?" Ayasha asked. "The prophecy, the trials, every day," Jacob admitted, "but not the way you might think. I don't wonder if it was real anymore. I know it was real. I felt it in every moment, from the river to the fire. But I think maybe the prophecy was never really about an ancient debt. I think it was about giving to broken people a reason to save each other." "Maybe it was both," Ayasha said. "Maybe the prophecy was real, And maybe it was also just life doing what life does, bringing people together who need each other. Does it matter which? Jacob thought about that. Did it matter if there had been a literal supernatural force guiding them? Or if it had all been chance and choice and the human capacity for connection? In the end, the result was the same. He was here, alive, no longer alone, part of something larger than his own grief. No, he said finally, it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do with it. Ayasha leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the river flow past, carrying with it twigs and leaves and memories. The water that had nearly taken her life had also brought them together, and now it was just water again, ancient, patient, indifferent to human drama. Thank you, Jacob said quietly. For what? For taking my hand, that day on the river, in the earthquake, in the fire, for not letting go. You took mine first, Ayasha reminded him. Then thank you for holding on. She turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the sky and the water and something deeper, something that looked like love, or at least the beginning of it. Jacob Thornwood, she said formally, I release you from the debt your ancestor incurred. The prophecy is fulfilled, the trials are complete, and the balance is restored. You are free. And if I don't want to be free? He asked. What if I want to stay here, with you, and see where this goes? Ayasha smiled, the kind of smile that transforms a face from merely beautiful to luminous. Then I would say that maybe the real prophecy wasn't about paying a debt at all, she said. Maybe it was about finding each other in a world that's very good at keeping people apart. Maybe it was about learning that sometimes you have to be saved before you can save yourself. Jacob pulled her close, and as he did, he swore he heard something in the wind, a sound like drums beating in rhythm with his heart, like words spoken in a language older than English or Apache, words that might have been blessing or benediction or simply acknowledgement that something sacred had taken place. But when he listened more carefully, it was just the wind and the water, eternal and unchanging, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Behind them, the sun began to set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of fire and gold. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, carrying its secrets into the coming night. And on its banks, to people who'd been saved by water, tested by earth, and transformed by fire, stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Together, the way the prophecy had always intended, the way their hearts had known. From the moment their fingers first touched on a riverbank in early spring, when a desperate voice had cried out, "Take my hand, cowboy, before the river takes us both," and he had, and it had changed everything.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.